Good morning, everyone, and welcome to today's program on how to leverage your culture as a competitive advantage. It's my privilege to introduce today's speaker, but first I'd like to thank our audience for your attendance. As our web network, also known as the Worldwide Employee Benefits Network, celebrates its 40th anniversary year. I'm Alan Spira, president of the New York chapter of WEB and on our national board. WEB has been working with employee benefit professionals like you since 1983. For the last 40 years, WEB has been helping employee benefit professionals stay current on employee benefit trends across industries. Thought leadership and local networking events at chapters across the country have provided our members with professional continuing education credits, as well as ongoing relationship building opportunities. Our success comes from attendees like yourselves to our local chapter programming and networking events. I'm happy to say that after 3 long years since COVID, our New York chapter will be resuming in-person programming in Midtown Manhattan on March 23rd. I hope that those of you in the area will consider joining us. As we are about to start today's meeting, I'd like to thank our WEB national sponsors. Thank you to our gold sponsor, Thompson Hine, and our partner sponsors, the American Benefits Council, Practical Law, and BenefitsLink.com. I'd also like to thank our local sustaining sponsors, Aetna Medical Solutions, American Century Investments, Fidelity Investments, Invesco, John Hancock, MFS, Nationwide, New York Life Investments, Prudential, Transamerica, Voya, and Practical Law. Lastly, please feel free to reach out to our Executive Director, Mark Chappell, for more information on a web chapter near you and how to become a local or national sponsor. I'd like to remind everyone that you can use the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen to type in questions, which I will ask our speaker as we move to the Q&A towards the end of our hour together. And now I'd like to introduce today's speaker, David Friedman. David is an award-winning CEO, entrepreneur, author, and renowned public speaker. In 2011, he published his first book, Fundamentally Different, which is based on the insights he learned and taught through his leadership career. In 2021, he published the second edition of his book, Culture by Design, the definitive how-to manual for building a high-performance culture, even in the new remote work environment. His current company has helped hundreds of organizations throughout North America to implement his culture operating system, CultureWise. In 2021, David was named Speaker of the Year for Vistage International. David, thank you for being here with our web audience today.
Oh, it is totally my pleasure, Alan, and it's great to be with everybody. So here's what we're going to do this morning. We're going to make this a really fun and interesting session for you. And if there's 2 things that I really want to accomplish, one is to have you think about culture perhaps in some ways that are different and actually more practical and useful than perhaps you've ever done before. And secondly, and more importantly, to give you specific tools that you can bring back to your work to really create a high-performing culture that you can leverage as a competitive advantage. So I want to begin this morning by sharing with you a couple of stories that come from my travels around the country. So I come from the Philadelphia area. Yes, I am an Eagles fan. Yes, I'm still suffering from the Super Bowl loss. But I come from the Philadelphia area, and I'm usually traveling all over the country. And if you people that may know this, that Philadelphia is an American Airlines hub. And so if you're flying out of Philadelphia, you're going to be flying on American. And probably the only benefit of flying as much as I do is that I'm almost always upgraded to first class. And that makes a really big deal, particularly on longer flights. You know, short flights, not a big deal. You're on a long flight coming across the country, it really helps. And a number of months ago, I was doing a series of talks in Seattle, and I was flying back from Seattle back to Philadelphia, and I was upgraded. I was on American, and the flight attendant who was managing the first class cabin on this particular flight, her name was Allison. And this woman, Allison, was unusually good. And I say unusually because, as I said, I was on American. And she did a number of things that together created a different experience. So the first thing she did is she introduced herself. Like, how often do people not even introduce themselves? I find that just kind of odd. She had the list of names of people that were in first class, and she went down the row and she thanked each person by name. She said, Mr. Smith, thank you for being with us. Mr. Jones, thank you for flying with us. And she thanked each person for flying on American. She was, Philly being an American Airlines hub, as I said, many people who are flying to Philadelphia are going to be connecting to another flight. So she had the list of connections, and she said, she went down the row of people who had connections, and she said, Mr. Spear, I see that you're going to be going to Detroit next. We're landing at C3. You're going to be going out of D4. Do you know how to get there? And she just made sure she knew how to get, that everybody knew how to get where they needed to go. There was an older couple who was in the row in front of me. And this older couple, as sometimes older couples do, they looked a little confused. And so probably 3 times during the flight, she went up to them and she just reassured them to make sure they knew what to do when we got to Philadelphia. It was a long enough flight that there was a meal. And when it came time for the meal, this is again a small thing, but she got down at our eye level. And she spoke to us at our eye level instead of looking down on us as she asked us, what we wanted for our meal. When we got off the flight, and this was particularly notable, when we got off the flight, she had memorized everybody's name. So I was watching this. She wasn't even looking at a piece of paper. And as each person got off the flight, she thanked each person by name for flying with American. I mean, she was really good. Well, a few weeks ago, I was in Chicago, and anybody from Chicago would know this. I was flying back from O'Hare, which I happen to think, not to insult anybody, but I happen to think is the worst airport in the entire country. And I was flying back from O'Hare, and I was on American. It's an American hub as well. And I was upgraded again. And the flight attendant who was managing the first class cabin on this particular flight, his name was Michael. And this guy, Michael, was perfectly ordinary. Now, he wasn't terrible. He was just pretty average. He didn't introduce himself. The reason I knew his name is I was watching for this. He was wearing a name tag. And so that's how I knew. He didn't do anything. He did the safety things the way they always do them. He tried to sell us a credit card, which they do on every freaking American flight. 60,000 miles you can get if you buy this credit card. Some of you have probably experienced this. When it came time for, it was too short a flight for a meal, but he had these snack baskets. Anybody who flies in a lot knows this. He walked around with the snack basket and he stuck it in each person's face. He didn't say, would you like a snack? He just stuck the basket in our face. When it came time for the drink order, I'm a pretty big drinker. I had a ginger ale. When he brought me my ginger ale, I said, thank you. And he walked away. He didn't say, my pleasure. Is there anything else I can get you? He just walked away. Now, the interesting thing about this guy, Michael, is if I were to have asked this guy to rate himself on a 1 to 10 scale in terms of his performance on that flight, with 1 being he stunk, 10 was he was awesome, my guess is that he would have probably rated himself, I'm guessing 8, 9, maybe even a 10. That my guess is that he thought that he did a really good job. In fact, if I were to have, this is just, again, my theory. I don't think he was purposely half-assing it. That's a technical term, by the way. I think that it just didn't even occur to him that there was an Allison level of performance that was available to him. It wasn't even in his consciousness. So here's the first question that I want each of you in the audience to think about. If I were to interact with or even observe anybody in your operation, whether it was an advisor or it was a salesperson or it was a consultant or it was the receptionist, how confident are you that anybody that I happen to interact with would be an Allison versus a Michael? And would the chances that I get an Allison versus a Michael in your company mostly just be luck, roll the dice? We all have some wonderful people, and sometimes you get one of those. Or is that the way your company does business? And maybe most importantly, if you had a way that you could get most of your Michaels and turn them into Allisons, what would that be worth to your company? Because I would tell you that the single biggest factor that drives whether most of the people in your organization show up like Michael did or most of them show up like Allison did, is the culture in your company. That the culture in your organization affects everything that happens, not just your ability to attract and retain really good people in this ridiculous labor market that we're in, but it affects how they show up and do their work. It affects the pride they take in the quality of their work. It affects how they share information and collaborate. It affects how innovative they are. It affects how they deliver service to whoever your customers are. It affects every single thing that goes on. You know, I actually come from southern New Jersey. It's just outside of Philadelphia. I live in a small town outside of Philadelphia called Moorestown, New Jersey. It's actually a Quaker town that was founded in 1682. And I've lived in this town since I was 13 years old. That's a long time. And I went to Moorestown High School. My kids actually went to the same high school. And Moorestown High School has always been known for one particular sport. Believe it or not, it's the sport of women's lacrosse. Lacrosse is very big in the mid-Atlantic states, more so than some other parts of the country. And the women's lacrosse team in my town, for as many years as I can remember, virtually every year they're ranked in the top, I'm going to say 5 or 10 in the entire country. They went through one stretch where in an 18-year period, they won 17 state championships in 18 years. They went through one stretch where they won 228 games in a row without ever losing to a New Jersey team. And I find public high school sports dynasties to be a fascinating group of teams to study. You have them wherever you live. And they're interesting to me because they have two dynamics that make them kind of unusual. The first is that in a public high school, for the most part, you can't recruit. I mean, you're stuck with whoever happens to live in your town. Private schools are different, universities are different. Texas is different, if anybody here is from Texas. But you know, people aren't moving to Moorestown so the girls can play lacrosse. So think about that in the context of your company. Imagine if anybody who knocked on your door and said, hey, I'd like to work for you, you had to take them. How hard would that be to build a great organization? Yet that's what public high schools did. Secondly, in a school environment, you're turning over your roster every year. I mean, at least every couple of years as kids are graduating. So once again, think about that in the context of your company. Imagine if anybody who knocked on your door and said, I'd like to work for you, you had to take them, no choice. And you turned over your roster every year. How hard would that be to build a great organization? And yet that's what public high school sports dynasties do. So if you think about that, you think, well, then there's something going on there. And I don't think it's the water. I think what's happened in these teams is these teams have built championship cultures. They've built levels of expectation. You're a woman in my town and you join that lacrosse team and you immediately pick up a vibe or an expectation that, you know what, we play like champions here. And it causes people to elevate their game beyond what they might somewhere else. In fact, I'm convinced that if my family moved from Moorestown to anywhere else in the country, and my daughter goes to the local high school and she joins the lacrosse team, I don't think she's playing at the same level anymore. That, you know, that it's still her. She hasn't lost all her skills, but she's on a different team with a different set of expectations. And those expectations affect everything. And this happens in our companies too. That if you think about your employees, you could plot your employees on a very typical bell curve like most things. That on one end of the spectrum, you're going to have 5 or 10% of your people who are like that woman, Allison, that first flight attendant I was telling you about. You know, these are people, I call them rock stars. That woman, Allison, if she left American Airlines and she went to work for any of your companies, I guarantee you she'd be one of your best people. She just has this attitude that she's going to be great no matter where you put her. And we all have some people like that, and they're great. And on the other end of the spectrum, we all have 5 or 10% of our people who I often say will stink up the joint no matter where you put them. You could put these people in the best possible environment, and they're still not going to be very good. But in between, we've all got about 80% of our people who are going to go with the flow. You put those people in a high-performing environment, and those people are going to look around consciously and unconsciously, and they're going to figure out, I guess that's what they expect around here. And they'll raise their level of play to match what they see going on around them. And you take those exact same 80% of people, with whatever their skills, their talent, their knowledge, their ability, their experiences, put those same people in a low-performing environment, and those same people will sink to the level of the people around them, because the environment that we're in has this enormous influence over every single thing that happens. And when we understand that, and you don't have to have a PhD to know this, we all know this from our own experiences, what that suggests to me is that as leaders of our companies, if we had a way that we could more purposely, more systematically create that kind of a championship culture, that kind of a culture that would cause our people to elevate their game, well, that would seem like a pretty smart thing to do. And yet, as obvious as that sounds, my experience is that very few organizations do it. That most of us live with the culture that happens in our company instead of purposely creating the culture that we want. And what I want to share with you this morning is, okay, if you get that, well, how do you do it? And the good news is it's actually not that hard to do once you understand how to do it. And I'm going to make it easy for you. So here's what I want to do. I want to share with you a framework, a roadmap, a series of steps that it takes, in my experience, in order to purposely, systematically create and embed the culture that you want into every part of your company, whether your people are white collar or blue collar, whether they're working remotely or they're in the office or they're hybrid. How do you get the culture that you want so embedded in your people that you work here? That's just how we do things around here. And I call this framework the 8-step framework. 8 different things. And when we do these 8 things, this is how you purposely create and embed the culture that you want. And what I want to do is I want to share with you these 8 steps, and we'll talk about each of them just briefly so you have the context. And then I want to go back and I want to do a deep dive on 2 of the steps, because my experience tells me that while all of the 8 steps that I'm going to share with you are important, at the end of the day, if you just kind of cut to the chase, there are 2 of these 8 steps. They're actually the 2 in the middle of the diagram that's behind me. There are 2 of these 8 steps that have a disproportionate amount of influence over your success. In other words, if you do these 2 things well, you're going to be 80 or 90% of the way down the road to success. And if you don't do these 2 things well, you're never going to get very far. So in the interest of our time in this webinar, to give you the most value I can, we're going to talk about all the 8 steps briefly, and then go back and do a deeper dive on the 2 steps that'll most drive your success. So the first of these 8 steps is the most obvious of the steps, and yet it's got to be our starting point. And that is that we've got to be able to define with tremendous clarity exactly what we want that culture to be. Now, the reason I say this is obvious, of course, is how could you possibly go about building a specific culture if you can't tell me, well, what are you trying to build in the first place? I mean, that sounds pretty obvious. Yet as obvious as that sounds, my experience is that very few companies do this well. In fact, I'll bet that most of you on this webinar probably have some kind of a written set of vision, mission, core values for your organization. And yet I would tell you that most of the time, not always, but most of the time, it ends up being very fluffy and nebulous and not all that effective. It looks great on the website or on the walls, but it isn't all that effective. We've got to be a lot clearer than that. I sometimes say that defining a culture to me and driving a culture is more about teaching than it is anything else. It's not about the signs on the walls or the website. It's what are you and the other leaders in your company teaching your people day after day after day after day after day. And if you don't know what you're teaching them because you've never defined it clearly enough, you're not going to do it very effectively or very consistently. You know, I sometimes think of it almost like a curriculum. If we could build a whole curriculum around our culture, we'd have a lot better chance making sure that all of our leaders are teaching the exact same thing, and we'd start to see that consistency. So one of the first things I want to do is I'm going to come back and do a deeper dive on this, is I want to teach you a new and a different way to define exactly what you want your culture to be and how to build a whole curriculum around it so that everybody's teaching the same thing. I'm going to show you how to do that. The second step in our overall framework is one of the simplest things I've ever learned, and it's actually one of the most powerful things I've ever learned. I call it creating rituals. Creating rituals is all about how we make things last. because we all have the experience in our organizations. I know it. Rolling out new programs and new initiatives. This is going to be great. And then 3 months later, we got really busy. We got a big customer. We lost the customer. And next thing we knew, it fell by the wayside and became another flavor of the month. Now, you guys have probably never done that, but you probably have friends in companies who've done that. Candidly, if the only thing that happens on this webinar is you pick up a couple of tidbits of ideas and then you mess around with it for a little while and forget it, it's a waste of your time. It's a waste of my time. The only way this is valuable is if I can introduce you to the concepts that'll enable you to take what I show you this morning and still implement it and still be practicing it 3 years from now, 5 years from now, 10 years from now. This has to be sustainable for the long haul, or there's no point wasting your time with it. And the key to that is this ridiculously simple and yet incredibly powerful concept that I call creating rituals. I'm going to explain that further. And when I explain that, I know you're going to say, God, that makes so much sense. Why didn't I think about that myself? It's so simple, but you're not thinking about it right now. We're going to come back and talk about that. All right, the third step in the overall 8-step framework, I call it selecting. And as you might guess from the name, what I'm referring to is how do you pick the right people to join your team? And when I say the right people, I'm talking about people who are going to be a good fit for the culture that you're trying to create. Because we're never going to build a high-performing organization, a high-performing culture with people who don't fit. You know, I say when people show up to be interviewed by you, they're usually already, I call them fully baked by then. In other words, they are who they are. Their value system, how they look at the world, most of that's already done. You're not going to change them. And the reason I point this out again is that you're not likely to have a lot of luck taking people who aren't a fit in your culture and expecting to do some kind of an intervention to convert them into becoming a good fit. I mean, it can do it. It works in about 2 out of every 100 times. These are really lousy odds. So we have to start with people who are already a good fit because we're not going to change the ones that aren't. Now, that's easier said than done. Sure, David, sounds like a great idea, but it's not that easy. And I'll be honest with you, no matter how good we are, we're never going to bat 1,000 at recruiting. We're not. Let's just accept that. We're going to make mistakes. We've all done it. But I'll tell you, there's a big difference between the mistake that we make being, I interviewed this woman and I thought she was awesome. She looked like she had everything we needed. But it turns out I misjudged it. I didn't read the signs right. I didn't pick up on something maybe I should have seen. That's going to happen sometimes. And there are things we can do to improve our hit rate, but we're not going to eliminate that entirely. That, however, is a distinctly different mistake from the mistake being, I knew she wasn't a good fit and we hired her anyway. That's the mistake we have to avoid, and we all do it. You've all done it. I've done it. Single biggest reason we do that is usually desperation. We're short-staffed. We're looking for people. We've been interviewing. We can't seem to find what we're looking for. All right, let's just bring them in. I know they're not a good fit, but we'll deal with that later. And then we end up dealing with it later. 6 months later, we're getting rid of her. Then we got to clean up the messes that got created in the meantime. And then we got to redo the hire again anyway. But it takes a tremendous amount of leadership discipline on all of our parts to avoid that mistake. I mean, it's nice to say in the theoretical world, oh, you shouldn't do that. But each of us is running our companies in the real world where we are short-staffed and we are desperate and we're tempted to bring those people in. Sometimes I say it this way, sometimes it feels like we're comparing this candidate to an empty chair. Compared to an empty chair, she looked awesome. But was she really what we needed? Probably not. Again, it takes a lot of discipline to avoid that mistake. But we're never going to build the kind of company we're trying to build, bringing in people who aren't a good fit. Got to be disciplined about that. All right, the fourth step in our overall framework is something that I call integration. Integration is my word for what some of you call orientation, or some use the new agey term that I hate, onboarding. I hate that word. It always sounds like waterboarding to me. And in some companies, by the way, it's probably similar. But whatever words you want to use, it's the word that describes how do you take the people you just hired and how do you bring them into the organization? The reason that I use this particular word, integration, is I think it has a different connotation. Like orientation suggests I'm telling you about us. I'm orienting you to us, where integration is a word of assimilation. I'm bringing you into the fold. I'm making you a part of who we are. But whatever word you want to use, I don't really care. The point is, how you do that has a huge influence over your culture, huge. I say to people all the time, if I went to work in any of your companies, I would tell you that the first, I'm going to say maybe few days to a week, are just about the most important days in my entire career. This is where I'm figuring out what's the deal around here. These are my early impressions, and those early impressions tend to be lasting. There's an analogy I use sometimes when I talk about the power of this integration. And my analogy is, I come into your company at the beginning, and imagine this, I'm going to put a pair of eyeglasses on. And let's assume that those eyeglasses have a prescription lens in them. And based upon the prescription, the lens, I am going to see things differently. I could look at that drawing of the 8-step framework that I showed you before, and it would look a little different to me if I were wearing one prescription versus another, because the prescription is filtering or influencing my vision. Do you follow what I mean by this? So I'm going to put this pair of eyeglasses on, and it's going to influence everything I see from here forward. You have an opportunity from the very beginning to write the prescription for my glasses, to influence how I see, perceive, interpret, experience everything that happens after this. I think of it almost like brainwashing in a positive kind of way. You get to brainwash me to see the world through the lens that you want me to see it. And if you don't take advantage of that opportunity at the beginning, it's like allowing me to come in on that first day. And imagine there's a big pile of eyeglasses here, and I randomly pick one up and put them on, and who the heck knows what the prescription is? Or worse, what if some cynical jerk in your company with a lousy attitude grabs me on the first day and says, David, come on, you're the new guy. Here, let's have lunch together. Put my glasses on. Check these out. Let me tell you how things really happen in our company. You think that's going to have any influence? You're darn right. And good luck changing it later. It's not like 6 months later, I can say, you know what? I know we got off to a bad start. Could I just hit the reset button and do this over? No. You have one chance to do this right. And it's remarkable to me how few companies do this well. We spend so much time, effort, and resources in recruiting to find great people. And then so often we basically throw them to the wolves and say, good luck. Let me know if you have any questions. And we wonder why it didn't work out. If we spent a fraction of the resources that we spent in recruiting, and we pump those back into orchestrating every aspect of a new person's experience, it would have an enormous influence over our culture. Huge opportunity overlooked by most companies. Simple thing. All right, 5th step in our overall framework. I call it communicating our culture or making it visible. And when I say making it visible, I actually mean this in a very literal way. Now, this is a place I want to be very careful. I don't want anybody here to misunderstand what I'm about to suggest. I am not suggesting that if you put up some beautiful signs all over your walls of your office with your vision, mission, and values, that you're going to somehow magically transform your culture. And it's not that simple. And we've all seen, remember those successory prints? I don't see those as much anymore, but where you got the guys rowing on the river and it says teamwork, and the eagle flying and it says leadership. And I would see these in companies that I travel to, and I look at these signs on the walls, and then I look at their people and I think, I don't see people doing a lot of that. So the fact that we have some beautiful signs isn't going to magically transform our culture. However, if our culture is real, it's authentic, actually, the more I see it, the better. I mean, if the only time I ever see a physical written form of our culture is on the first day in the new hire paperwork, sandwiched between the benefit enrollment forms and the I-9 is an 8.5 by 11 with their vision, mission, and values. And that's the last time I've ever seen anything that has to do with our culture. How likely am I thinking about it? Not very. But if everywhere I look, I'm inundated with things about our culture, because it is on the walls. It's on an electronic display board in the reception area. It's on screensavers and mouse pads. It's in the men's room above the urinals and the women's room on the mirrors. And everywhere I look, there's stuff about our culture. There's a lot higher probability I'm thinking about it. I'm talking about it. I think of it just like internal advertising. the more I see this stuff around me, the more it's sinking in, the more it's becoming part of how I think. And again, this is not a replacement for the other things we need to do. It's just a really simple and yet important element of additional reinforcement to everything else we're doing. And you're limited only by your own creativity in all the different ways we can do it. All right, sixth step in our overall framework, I call it coaching. When I talk about coaching, what I'm referring to is how you use the day-to-day situations that come up in your organization to teach and reinforce your culture. You know, you're going to hear me say this a lot. To me, your culture isn't necessarily those signs on the walls. It's what your people are doing every day. And every day, you and other leaders of your company have lots of opportunities to give people coaching and feedback. A customer issue comes up, a vendor issue, an issue maybe between two employees, and you're giving them feedback about how to handle it. Well, every time in that feedback, you use the specific language and vocabulary of your culture in that coaching, you're pulling it off the wall or off the website, and you're making it real and relevant and meaningful. So many opportunities to do that. The use of that language is how you show people that we're not kidding around here. All right, seventh step in our overall framework is something you already know about, everybody on this webinar, and yet we still need to touch on it. And that is your own leadership example. You know this, I'm not telling you something new. Your people are watching you all the time, consciously and unconsciously. And they're taking their cue from you about what we really stand for around here. We could put up all kinds of beautiful signs on the walls. We could talk about this stuff till we're blue in the face. But at the end of the day, what you do tells them far more than anything else. And I know everybody knows that. But when you think about that, I say that as leaders, every one of us on this webinar, every one of us, one of our most important roles, it might even be our most important, is that every one of us is a teacher. That's really what we are. We're teachers. And it doesn't matter, by the way, whether you want that job or not. You're stuck with it simply by virtue of being a leader, because your people are watching you all the time and they're learning from every single thing that you do. They're even learning from things you don't do. You ever think about that? I mean, you see somebody in your operation behaving in a way that's inconsistent with what you claim your culture is, and you failed to address it. What do you think you just taught them? I guess it must be okay. You say it's important to show up on time and you're late. What do you think you just taught people? I guess it's okay to be late. Everything you do and everything you don't do is teaching them. So when you really think about that, I say that one of the implications of that is that you begin to really raise your level of intentionality about everything you're doing. In other words, you're about to do or say something, and it's almost like you've got a megaphone, and everything you do is amplified in its impact simply because of your role as a leader. In other words, somebody else in your company could do or say the same exact thing, and it doesn't have the same impact. You say it, it has magnified impact. So when you accept this, you just start, again, raising your level of intentionality about everything you're doing, because you are teaching all the time. All right, the eighth and the last step in the overall framework, then I'm going to go back and do that deeper dive, I promise, is I call it creating accountability for your culture. And when I talk about creating accountability, what I mean by that is this is how are we showing ourselves or people, the world, that we're not kidding, we're serious about this. Because if there's no accountability for it, it's just a wish, it's a hope. There's got to be some teeth behind this. A lot of different ways we can do that. For example, I'll bet some of you on this webinar do this. How many of you can raise your hands to yourself, since I can't see you, but how many of you have elements of your culture built into your performance review system? I mean, if I was in your company and I'm sitting with my manager doing whatever a performance review looks like in your company, and nowhere in the conversation is there any discussion at all about our culture, what conclusion do you think I'd come to? It's probably not that important. It's not the only thing there, but it ought to be there somewhere if it was important to us. Of course, it would be difficult to do that in any substantive way if I didn't have enough clarity about what my culture was supposed to be in the first place. Here's another example of of accountability. This is something I do in my company and many of our clients. So my company's culture, which you're going to learn about in a few minutes, is based upon a very specific set of behaviors that we practice in our company. One of them, just to give you an example, is one that I call honor commitments. So we have this list of behaviors that define our culture. And then what we do is we do this annual survey. And on this survey, what we do is we take each of the behaviors that define our culture and we write a description of what would you see if we were doing this well. So for example, honor commitments would say, our employees do what they say they're going to do when they say they're going to do it. That's what I mean by honoring commitments. So we write a description like that for each of the behaviors that define our culture. Then every year we survey 3 groups. We survey all of our customers. We survey all of our vendors and suppliers. We survey all of our own employees. And we ask them on each one of these specific line items in your interactions with us, do we almost always, usually, sometimes, seldom, or never do this? Now we're being really transparent. I mean, this is a bunch of BS, or we actually do these things. Then we take the almost always, usually, sometimes, seldom, or never, and we convert that to a 5, 4, 3, 2, 1 scale. And we can now actually put a number on how well we live for the stuff we talk about. If you're into continuous improvement like I am, you could look at what your score is this year, resurvey next year and ask, have we improved the degree of consistency between what we claim we stand for and actually what shows up every day? Now we're being pretty clear. So here's the most interesting thing, though, about this. The single biggest way that you can demonstrate seriousness or accountability for your culture is getting rid of somebody who isn't a fit. And it's typically a high performer. You know, every company I've ever worked with practically has at least one person who desperately needs to be fired. They're a pain in the butt. They're opposite of everything we say is important. We talk about them in our management meetings over and over again, and they're still here. My anecdotal study of this, see if this matches your experience. My experience is about 70 to 75% of these people tend to be salespeople. Did you ever notice that? About 10 to 15% are usually in finance, and about 10 to 15% usually have some kind of a technical skill. And what do they all share in common that makes us reluctant to get rid of them? They have something that we're worried about our ability to replace. If it was the classic salesperson, he or she's a pain in the butt, they're opposite of everything we say matters, but man, they bring in a lot of business. Or they have some of our most important customer relationships. I mean, this culture stuff's nice, but I'm not stupid. I'm not going there. I mean, if it's the finance person, she's been with us for 27 years and our business is so complicated, I don't even want to think about what it would look like to replace her. If it's the technical guy, he's got a skill set. Those guys aren't walking around the street. I lose that guy. I don't know how you replace that guy. And that's the excuse we use for not dealing with it. We allow ourselves to be held hostage by these people. And all the while, we're sending a loud, clear message to the whole company. We're telling people, folks, I want you to understand our culture is really important here. Unless you produce enough business, that's what we're telling them. I sometimes say it this way. This is kind of blunt, but the best way for me to really know your culture is to look at the behavior that you tolerate. I don't care about all the stuff you put on the website or you told me the first day. What you allow to go on in your company, that's the real culture. Everything else is just a bunch of fluff. And it's so fascinating. Almost all of us have had this experience. And when we finally fire that person, everybody in the company says, thank you. What took you so long? And then we're kicking ourselves, thinking to ourselves, I should have done that a long time ago. But think about the message that you just sent to those who are sitting on the fence about culture. You just got rid of Susie, and she was our #1 sales star. They're not kidding. I better get my butt in gear. The clearest message you'll ever send that we're not kidding. We're serious about this. So this is the framework we're going to use to think about how we could be much more purposeful, much more systematic in building and embedding the culture we want. Now, I want to go back and I want to just do a little bit deeper dive on the 2 things that I said drive the most impact, the 2 things in the middle. So we talk about how to define our culture. And when we talk about how to do that, I want to draw a very important language distinction for you. And this language distinction is really significant. It's a distinction between what I call values and what I call behaviors. So let me explain what the difference is and why this is important, why it's not just a question of semantics. So a value to me is typically an abstract concept. So examples of values are things like integrity, quality, respect, innovation, teamwork, passion, commitment. These are ideas, concepts. A behavior, in contrast, is an action. It's something I can literally see people doing. Some of the behaviors that I teach in my company are things that are right behind me. Honor commitments, I mentioned that before. Practice blameless problem solving. Be a fanatic about response time. Get clear on expectations. Follow up on everything. Do what's best for the customer. Listen generously. These are actions that people do. So a value is an abstract idea, a behavior is an action. In parts of speech, I sometimes think of it like a value is a noun, where a behavior is a verb. It's a thing versus an action. Now, okay, got it. Why does that matter? Well, here's why this is important and not just a question of semantics. The problem in my experience with most companies, not all, but most companies' traditional looking set of core values is that they tend to be so abstract and so nebulous that they mean too many different things to too many different people, and they therefore become very difficult to operationalize in any meaningful kind of way. So let me give you a really simple example. One of the core values that I see in many organizations, and maybe some of you have this in your company, is I'll say the core value for respect. We should all respect each other. And it sounds like a perfectly good thing. I mean, who would argue with that, especially these days? But what does that word mean? It means a lot of different things to different people. If you grew up in an inner city gang, your definition of what it looks like to respect somebody, or perhaps to diss them, could be a lot different than what maybe it means in your family. Or I think about regional differences. Those of you on this webinar who grew up in the South, in the Alabama, Georgia, Mississippi, those kinds of areas, many of you were probably taught when you were raised as children that when you speak to an adult, you call them sir or ma'am. It's disrespectful not to do that. I'll tell you what, do that in the Northeast where I live, that's just freaking weird. It has nothing to do with respect at all, just different norms. I have a college friend of mine, I'm actually going to see him this week, who lives in Columbus, Ohio, and or outside of Columbus, he's a school superintendent in Ohio of a large public school district. And I was with him last year, and he was telling me that the teachers in his school district were angry with him because they felt disrespected because they didn't get a large enough pay increase. He looks at this and says, that's a budget issue. That has nothing to do with respect. To them, oh, it's a respect issue for sure. We all have different ideas of what this word means. So to simply say, well, one of our core values is respect, okay, it sounds fine. I just don't know that it's all that helpful. Behaviors, because they're so much more action-oriented, are much easier to teach and coach and guide and give people feedback about. They're easier to operationalize. It is very difficult, if you've ever tried it, to coach somebody about their values. But I could coach them all day long about what I see them doing, or maybe even not doing. So ultimately, behaviors end up being a lot more useful. So I advocate that we define our culture, not necessarily in terms of that big, broad, typical set of core values, but rather in terms of the behaviors that you say, if I could get the people in our organization to do these things more consistently, we'd be taking no prisoners in our marketplace. Those are the behaviors that really define the culture that you want to have. I happen to give those behaviors a name. It's just my own name, my own nomenclature that I made up years ago. I call them fundamentals because they're fundamental to success. So the first thing we've got to do is we've got to define our culture way more clearly by defining a set of fundamental behaviors that, once again, you say, if I could get everybody doing these things, that's the culture I really want to build here. That's going to be a lot more useful. Now, once we have that set of behaviors, and that's, again, how we're going to define what we want our culture to be, once we have that set of behaviors, The second step, the real game changer here, is this concept that I call creating rituals. So let me explain to you what a ritual is and why this is such an important topic. So a ritual to me is some behavior or some practice that we do over and over and over again until it becomes embedded. It becomes second nature to us. So simple example of a ritual you're all familiar with is think about every time you go to a professional sporting event, or even a collegiate one for that matter, what happens right before the first kickoff of every football game, the first pitch of a baseball game, the tip-off of a basketball game, every single time? We do the national anthem. You don't go to a game and say, I wonder if we'll do the national anthem tonight. It's not like if they're not running behind schedule, they see if they can squeeze it in, or they don't assign it to somebody and say, it's your job to remember tonight. It's just what we do. And the reason that's so important, not the anthem specifically, but this idea of ritual, is that it's our nature as human beings that most humans stink at sticking with things. We're just not very good at it. We start the diet and exercise program that doesn't last. I mean, I would bet that in January, every gym in your area was probably mobbed because this is the year, I'm setting my New Year's resolutions. I'm going to get healthy this year. And then by February, where we are now, they're all back to their normal levels of activity. I was doing a talk, I think I was in North Carolina a few months ago, and there was a guy in the group. This guy owned like 10 Wendy's franchises. And he explained to the group that even at Wendy's, the food mix is different in January. People are buying salads at a level in January that they don't the rest of the year. So we all struggle with sticking with things. When something becomes a ritual, though, it's not hard to stick with it. It just becomes what we do. There's kind of a silly example I use in a lot of my talks about this. And I'll ask an audience, let's say today's Wednesday that we're doing this. I'll ask an audience, how many of you, when you woke up on Monday morning this week, said this to yourself? It's a brand new week. And this week, I'm going to be really focused, determined, disciplined. And I'm going to see if I can go every single day this week. And I mean, literally every day, not even missing one, brushing my teeth every morning. And everybody laughs because obviously that's silly. And I asked them, so, you didn't say it? How many of you are still on the streak? And they all, of course, raise their hand. And I'll ask them, so how are you pulling that off? And they say, I have a ritual. I wake up in the morning and I go through a series of activities. I probably don't even remember doing it. Most of us don't wake up in the morning struggling to do this. We're not sitting there saying, I just don't feel like doing it today. I mean, I brushed my teeth yesterday, but I'm just not in the mood today, but I probably should. This isn't a struggle. It's just what you do. That's the power of a ritual. Once something becomes a ritual, it's not hard to do. It's just what we do. So here's the way we can use that simple concept. What we do is we take those behaviors, those fundamentals, as I call them, we roll it out to people in highly interactive, engaged work sessions in the organization, and then we begin to focus on one fundamental each week through a series of rituals. So week number one, everybody in the company all week long is thinking about working on focusing and practicing fundamental number one. And I'll give you an example in just a moment of how. The week after that, everybody in the company all week long is focused on fundamental number two. And the week after that, 3, 4, 5, and so on. And at the end of the list, we go back to the beginning and we do it over and over and over and over again every week for the rest of our lives, because that's the only way it sinks in. So let me give you an example of what do I really mean by that. So in my company and every one of our clients, one of the things that we do is every time we have a meeting in our company, whether it's a project team meeting, a team meeting, a leadership meeting, a Zoom meeting, my current company is all remote. We've got 18 people all remote. And so all of our meetings are on Zoom. Every meeting we have this week, the first agenda item of the meeting is the fundamental of the week. And we spend the first 3 to 5 minutes talking about it. What does it mean? How do we practice it? What can we do better about it? 3 to 5 minutes. We don't want to take over the meeting, just a few minutes, and then we move on. But every meeting all week long this week, every single one of those, we're talking about the fundamental of the week. So think about your company and think about all the meetings that may go on this week in your company. Some that have already gone on, some that'll go on the rest of this week. And imagine that if in every one of those meetings, every single one of your employees was talking about the same principle. Think about the amount of teaching that would be taking place. These things would start to be internalized by your people. That's just one example of a ritual. There are a number of different other rituals that I practice in my company and all of our clients practice in theirs. But the idea is that if we could take if we could be really clear about the behaviors that drive success in this company, and then we can create this structured, systematic way to teach those one at a time, over and over and over and over again, and keep cycling through them, sooner or later, these behaviors are going to become internalized in our people. And that's the simple idea. You know, just to kind of summarize this, and then I'll open this up for a couple of questions. But to summarize it, I sometimes think of it this way. If you want to learn to master anything you want to learn to master, whether we're talking about you want to become a concert pianist, or you want to learn to be a master cabinet maker, or speak another language, or anything that you want to master, what do you have to do to master something? Lots and lots and lots and lots of practice. The problem is most of us hate practicing. Well, that's kind of the big problem. If the only way we're going to master something is through lots of practice, except most humans hate practicing, well, that's kind of a problem. Well, the key to being able to keep that practice and repetition going is creating rituals. Once something becomes a ritual, the fundamental of the week, brushing our teeth, the national anthem. When I was a kid in school, we used to say the Pledge of Allegiance. Some people before a meal, they say a prayer. Once it becomes embedded as an automatic ritual, it's not hard to do. That's just what we do around here. So the ritual is the foundation or the platform or the structure that enables that repetition to keep going. And the repetition is what's necessary in order to master something. So the basic concept here, again, is if driving a culture through your company ultimately is nothing fancier or more complicated than getting your people to live and internalize the behaviors that drive success in your company, well, they're not going to internalize those behaviors simply because you held a big company meeting one day and announced it them, or because you put posters all over the walls, or because you put it in their performance reviews. The only way they're going to internalize them is when we teach it to them over and over and over and over and over and over again. And the only way we're ever going to teach it to people with that much repetition without becoming bored and lazy and quitting is when it becomes a ritual. That's why rituals are so foundational to success in anything, and especially as it relates to our culture. So let me just sort of bring us back to the overall picture here and say that the concept I want you to consider is that at the end of the day, your culture has more influence over the performance of your people than probably any other single lever that you can pull to impact performance. And if we understand that, we ought not to just leave our culture to chance, to the whims of whatever happens. We've got to be really systematic about it. And if we want to be systematic about it, this 8-step framework gives you the model for thinking about how you could be a lot more systematic. And while all of those 8 steps are important, the reason I do this drawing the way that I do is I sometimes say the ones around the outer rim, I sometimes call those incremental. You could look at how you're doing it, selecting the best people to fit your culture, and you could make incremental improvements to get better. And you could look at your integration program in whatever form it exists today and make incremental improvements to get better. But the 2 things in the middle that I was just talking about, I don't think these are incremental. If you don't define with enough clarity exactly what you want your culture to be, and I say do it in behavioral terms, you're not going to get very far. Secondly, once you've defined those, unless you teach them over and 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 over again, they're not going to become embedded in your people. And that's why creating rituals is so foundational to your success. So that's the framework. I'll finish this and then open up to a couple questions in the last couple minutes with a quote that is my favorite quote on the topic of culture. And the quote says that good companies have good cultures by chance, but world-class companies have world-class cultures by design. The best companies in the world don't leave any of this to chance. It is simply too important to your company's success to just wing it, leaving it to chance. Instead, the best companies are incredibly intentional, purposeful, and systematic about every aspect of how they build, create, and embed the culture they want into every part of their company. None of it is left to chance. So let me close it there. We got a few minutes left. And Alan, if you want to bring up any questions that people have had, I'm certainly happy to answer any questions that people would like to throw out.
David, thank you. While people are thinking about questions, I love the way that you brought out the, keep it simple method with the
Yeah.
airline example. Treat people how you would like to be treated. The results of your women's lacrosse at the high school is really the challenges that we all face in terms of who shows up and what we have to deal with. A question for you is, how do you measure return on investment on doing the right thing? Is it as simple as looking at sales, or?
Yeah, it's a good question, Alan. So my point of view about that, and I differ from some people, is that I don't quote a specific measurement like that. And the reason I don't, you will read articles that will say, if you work on your culture, or companies that have an intentional culture are going to see 20% higher, production or sales or lower turnover and all those things. And they're all true in general, but I don't like to make a quote about that because I don't think you can isolate the variables. To your example, if you had a 20% increase in sales next year, is that because you hired a new salesperson? Because one of your competitors went out of business? Because you came out with a new product line? Or because you implemented this program? All of them have some influence, and you can't isolate, can't hold everything constant, and the only thing that changed is this. So I don't like to make those claims, but here's what I would say. If you can articulate the behaviors that drive success in your company, we can, through surveys, we can measure that your people are doing those behaviors more consistently. It sure as heck isn't a big leap of faith to figure it's got to have had a significant impact on that. But I don't like to make a claim about those numbers because I don't think you can isolate the variables.
So is that another way of saying that the survey and the survey results are the key performance indicators that you compare over time to measure
They
success?
are key performance indicators that show that we're doing the things that we say are important more consistently. And we know intuitively that if we do those things better, it's got to be contributing to results in a significant way. I would tell you that I have many, many clients that say the implementation of what we've been talking about on this webinar has been the single most impactful thing they've done in the history of their companies. It's that impactful.
Okay. Well, David, I have no further questions today. You've done a thorough job, and I believe in the merits of what you speak, and congratulations on being the Vistage Speaker of the Year, having just come back from a national event where I met 800 speakers, and knowing that you spoke in front of 700 of them, I think that's an incredible accomplishment.
Well, it's my pleasure. I'll just leave people with, if you would like to know more about this, my email address is david@culturewise.com, and certainly happy to have further conversation with anybody that'd like to learn more.
And David, I'd like to thank you for a terrific presentation and taking time to address our web audience today on organizational culture. Thank you again to our national sponsors and guests who joined us for today's program. Special thank you for Mike McDermott for introducing David to us. And I'd like to just mention, please follow Web on LinkedIn as we continue to celebrate our 40th anniversary year. And please reach out to our Executive Director, Mark Chappell, with questions on chapters near you and how to become a local or national sponsor. We look forward to continuing our conversations with you all. Thank you and have a great day.
Have a great day, folks.